At Easter dinner, Mom yelled, "You're a burden, and we don't want you here anymore." The next morning, when I packed my bags and they realized I was paying most of their bills, Mom suddenly came begging me to stop. I, 29M, never thought Easter dinner would be the day my entire family dynamic would explode, but here we are. Let me start from the beginning because this mess has been brewing for years, and I need to get it all out. After college, I landed a decent job in tech and moved back home temporarily to save money for my own place. Temporarily turned into 3 years because, honestly, it was convenient for everyone. My parents' mortgage was underwater after Dad's construction business took a hit during the recession, and my younger sister was still in community college. When I started contributing to household expenses, it just made sense to stay. What started as helping with groceries turned into me covering the mortgage, utilities, car payments, and pretty much everything else. Dad's pride took a beating when his business failed, and he'd been doing odd jobs here and there, but nothing steady. Mom worked part-time at a local clinic, but her income barely covered groceries for a week. My sister worked at a coffee shop, but her earnings went toward her tuition and personal expenses. I didn't mind helping initially. Family is family, right? But somewhere along the way, I became the invisible ATM. No one asked how my day went or if I needed anything. Conversations revolved around bills that needed paying or repairs that needed fixing. I was the solution to every financial problem, but somehow also the source of every family tension. The resentment started building when I realized I was being taken for granted. My parents would make plans without consulting me, assuming I'd cover whatever costs came up. When the washing machine broke, they bought a new one and expected me to handle the payment. When my sister wanted to take a spring break trip with friends, suddenly there were hints about how nice it would be if someone could help her out. I started feeling like a stranger in what was supposed to be my home. My parents would have conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My sister would roll her eyes whenever I tried to join family discussions. The house felt cold despite me keeping the heat on and paying for it. Easter Sunday started like any other family gathering. My aunt and uncle came over with their kids, and Mom had prepared this elaborate dinner that probably cost more than she made in a week. I knew I'd be getting the credit card bill later, but I kept quiet. Everyone was laughing and sharing stories, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Then my cousin started talking about his new apartment and how excited he was to be independent. My aunt made some comment about how wonderful it must be to have your own space and not burden your parents. The conversation naturally shifted to adult children living at home, and that's when things got uncomfortable. My uncle, probably trying to be supportive, mentioned how responsible I was for helping my family during tough times. But instead of appreciation, I saw my parents exchange looks. My sister actually snorted and made some comment about how some people never learn to leave the nest. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My aunt tried to change the subject, but my mother had this look on her face that I'd seen before. It was the same expression she wore when she was about to say something she'd been holding back for too long. She started talking about how different things were when she was my age, how people didn't rely on their parents for everything, how independence was something you earned, not something you postponed. Her voice was getting louder, and everyone at the table was looking uncomfortable. Then she turned to me directly and said I was a burden and they didn't want me there anymore. The words hit like a physical blow. She said I was holding everyone back, that I was using them as an excuse to avoid growing up, and that it was time for me to figure out my own life instead of hiding behind family obligations. The room went completely silent. My aunt looked horrified, my uncle was staring at his plate, and my sister was actually smiling like she'd been waiting for this moment. My father just sat there, not defending me, not saying anything. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. Here I was, the person keeping their house from foreclosure, being told I was the problem. I wanted to scream about every bill I'd paid, every sacrifice I'd made, every time I'd put their needs before my own. But I just sat there, processing what had just happened. My aunt tried to smooth things over, suggesting that maybe everyone was just stressed and should take a break. But my mother wasn't done. She kept going about how I needed to take responsibility for my own life and stop making everyone else responsible for my comfort and security. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. I excused myself from the table and went to my room. I could hear hushed conversations downstairs, probably my aunt trying to figure out what had just happened and why my mother had exploded like that. I spent the rest of Easter Sunday in my room, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I realized that somewhere along the way, the narrative had been flipped. Instead of being the son who stepped up when his family needed help, I'd become the burden who was taking advantage of their generosity. That night, I made a decision. I started looking at apartments online and calculating what I'd need for a security deposit and first month's rent. I had enough saved up because, ironically, living at home had allowed me to build up my savings even while covering most of their expenses. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day apartment hunting. I found a decent one-bedroom place about 20 minutes away and put down a deposit. The landlord said I could move in by the weekend if my application was approved. When I got home that evening, my parents were in the living room watching TV like nothing had happened. My mother asked where I'd been all day, and I told her I'd been looking at apartments. She seemed surprised, like she hadn't expected me to actually do anything about her Easter dinner outburst. I told them I'd found a place and would be moving out by the weekend. My father finally spoke up, asking if I was sure I was ready for that kind of responsibility. The question was so absurd I almost laughed. I'd been handling responsibility for years, just not my own. Tuesday, I started packing. I didn't have much personal stuff since most of the furniture and household items belonged to my parents or had been purchased with the understanding that they were for the family home. I focused on my clothes, electronics, and personal documents. My sister made a few comments about how it was about time I grew up and moved out. She seemed genuinely happy that I was leaving, probably thinking she'd have more space and fewer restrictions. She had no idea what was coming. Wednesday, I went to the bank and set up automatic transfers to stop on Friday. I also called the utility companies and arranged to have my name removed from the accounts. The customer service representatives were helpful, though they did warn me that the accounts would need to be transferred to someone else or they'd be shut off. I called the mortgage company and explained that I'd no longer be contributing to the payments. They were understanding but mentioned that they'd need to speak with the primary account holders about the change in payment arrangements. Thursday evening, my mother asked when exactly I was planning to leave and whether I needed help with anything. I told her I'd be gone by Saturday morning and that I'd handle everything myself. She seemed relieved, probably thinking this would solve whatever family tension had been building up. Friday was my last day of work before the weekend, and I was actually excited about starting fresh. I'd been feeling suffocated for months, and the idea of having my own space again was liberating. Saturday morning, I loaded my car with the last of my belongings. My parents were having coffee in the kitchen when I stopped by to leave my house key. I told them I'd left some information on the counter about the bills and accounts that would need to be transferred. My mother glanced at the papers and asked what I meant. I explained that since I was no longer living there, I'd removed my name from the utilities and stopped my contributions to the household expenses. The look on her face was priceless. She started asking about the mortgage payment, the electric bill, the internet, the car insurance. I told her those were all things they'd need to handle now that I wasn't a burden anymore. My father looked confused, like he was trying to do math in his head. I left them sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills and account information I'd organized for them. It felt good to walk out that door knowing I was finally free from the weird dynamic that had developed over the past 3 years. Update 1. I'd been in my new apartment for exactly 4 hours when my phone started ringing. It was my mother, and she sounded panicked. She was asking when I was planning to transfer money for the mortgage payment that was due Monday. I told her I wasn't planning to transfer any money since I no longer lived there. She started explaining that they'd been counting on my contribution and that they couldn't cover the full payment without me. I reminded her that just a few days ago, I was told I was a burden and wasn't wanted there anymore. The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. My father got on the phone and started talking about family obligations and how we needed to work together during difficult times. I found it interesting that family obligations only seemed to flow in one direction. He asked if we could work out some kind of arrangement where I'd continue helping with expenses even though I'd moved out. I told them I needed to focus on my own responsibilities now, just like they'd suggested. The conversation ended with my mother saying they'd figure something out and that we'd talk later. Sunday, my sister called. She was suddenly very interested in having a conversation, which was unusual since we'd barely spoken in months. She started by saying she thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding about the Easter dinner situation. She explained that Mom had been stressed about money and probably didn't mean what she said about me being a burden. She suggested that maybe I was being too sensitive and that I should consider the impact my leaving would have on the family. I asked her if she'd be willing to help cover some of the household expenses since she was so concerned about the family's financial situation. She quickly changed the subject and started talking about how her coffee shop job barely covered her own expenses. The conversation was enlightening. She wanted me to continue funding the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, but she wasn't willing to make any sacrifices herself. When I pointed this out, she got defensive and said it wasn't the same thing because she was still in school. I reminded her that I'd been contributing to household expenses since I started working, even when I was paying off my own student loans. She didn't have much to say to that. Update 2. Monday evening, my phone was buzzing constantly. My parents had apparently spent the day trying to figure out their finances and had come to the realization that they were in serious trouble without my contributions. My mother called and started the conversation by apologizing for what she'd said at Easter dinner. She explained that she'd been feeling overwhelmed and had taken her frustrations out on me unfairly. She said she appreciated everything I'd done for the family and hoped we could work things out. I listened to her apology, but I could tell it was motivated more by financial panic than genuine remorse. She kept steering the conversation toward the immediate problem of covering the bills rather than addressing the underlying issues that had led to the Easter dinner explosion. She asked if I'd consider moving back home, saying they'd all try to be more appreciative and that we could establish better communication. When I declined, she asked if I'd at least continue helping with the mortgage until they could figure out a long-term solution. I told her I understood they were in a difficult position, but that I needed to prioritize my own financial stability now. I'd spent 3 years putting their needs first, and it was time for me to focus on building my own future. Tuesday, my father showed up at my new apartment. He looked tired and stressed, and he started by saying he was proud of me for taking the step to get my own place. He said he should have said something during the Easter dinner incident and that he regretted not standing up for me. We talked for about an hour, and it was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in years. He admitted that they'd become too dependent on my income and that it wasn't fair to expect me to carry that burden indefinitely. He also acknowledged that my mother's comments had been hurtful and inappropriate, regardless of whatever stress she was feeling. He said he'd been struggling with his own feelings of inadequacy about not being able to provide for his family the way he used to. I appreciated his honesty, but I also made it clear that I wasn't going to resume my previous role as the family's financial safety net. I offered to help them create a budget and explore options for managing their expenses, but I wasn't going to continue paying their bills. Update 3. By Wednesday, the reality of their situation had fully set in. My mother called again, and this time she was crying. She said they'd received a notice from the mortgage company about the missed payment and that they were facing potential foreclosure if they couldn't catch up. She begged me to reconsider, saying that losing the house would destroy the family. She promised that things would be different if I came back, that they'd treat me with more respect and appreciation. I felt bad hearing her cry, but I also recognized that this was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that had kept me trapped in that situation for so long. Every time I'd considered moving out before, there had been some crisis that required my financial intervention. I told her I was sorry they were going through this, but that they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in their home. I couldn't be both a burden they didn't want and a financial resource they couldn't live without. Thursday, my sister called again, and this time she was angry. She accused me of being selfish and abandoning the family when they needed me most. She said I was punishing everyone for something Mom said when she was upset. I asked her what she was doing to help with the family's financial situation. She said she was just a student and couldn't be expected to contribute the way I could. I pointed out that she was 22 years old and perfectly capable of working full-time if the family's financial survival was really at stake. She got quiet when I mentioned that she'd been spending money on clothes, entertainment, and other non-essentials while I was covering the basic household expenses. She'd never had to make the kind of sacrifices I'd been making because she knew I'd handle whatever she couldn't or wouldn't pay for. The conversation ended with her saying I'd changed and that I wasn't the brother she used to know. She was right about that. I had changed. I'd finally realized that being family doesn't mean accepting unlimited financial responsibility for everyone else's choices. Friday, exactly 1 week after I'd moved out, my parents showed up at my apartment together. They looked defeated, and my mother immediately started apologizing again. She said she'd been wrong about everything and that she wanted me to come home. They'd spent the week trying to figure out how to manage their expenses without my income. and it had been a wake-up call about how much I'd been contributing. My father had picked up additional work, and my mother was looking into full-time positions, but they were still facing a significant shortfall. They offered to pay me rent if I'd move back home, essentially trying to recreate our previous arrangement, but with different terminology. I declined and explained that the issue wasn't just about money or living arrangements. The problem was that I'd been taken for granted and treated like my contributions didn't matter until they were gone. I'd been made to feel like a burden, while simultaneously being expected to carry the family's financial responsibilities. I told them I loved them and wanted to maintain a relationship, but that I needed to establish healthy boundaries. I couldn't continue being their financial safety net, while also being blamed for whatever family problems arose. My mother asked what they were supposed to do about the house. I suggested they consider downsizing, getting roommates, or exploring other options that didn't depend on my income. These were all things they could have been doing over the past 3 years instead of relying on me to cover their expenses. Final update. It's been 2 months since I moved out, and the situation has stabilized somewhat. My parents ended up selling the house and moving into a smaller apartment that they can afford on their combined income. My father found steady work with a local contractor, and my mother took a full-time position at a different clinic. My sister had to get a second job to help with expenses, and she's finally understanding what it means to prioritize financial responsibilities over personal wants. She's still not thrilled with me, but she stopped calling me selfish. The family dynamic has definitely changed. We have dinner together once a month, and the conversations are different now. There's less assumption that I'll solve whatever problems come up, and more discussion about how everyone can contribute to solutions. My mother has apologized several more times, and I think she genuinely understands that her Easter dinner outburst was the culmination of years of misplaced resentment. She was frustrated about their financial situation and took it out on the person who was actually helping them the most. My father and I have developed a better relationship now that there's less financial tension between us. He's proud of the work he's been doing and feels more like himself again. He's also been more supportive of my decisions and boundaries. I'm doing well in my own place. I've been able to save more money, pursue some hobbies I'd neglected, and even start dating again. I'd forgotten how much energy it takes to constantly worry about other people's financial problems. The whole experience taught me that helping family is important, but not at the expense of your own well-being and self-respect. I spent 3 years being the solution to everyone else's problems while my own needs and feelings were ignored. Sometimes the people you're helping the most are the ones who appreciate it the least. It took removing myself from the situation for everyone to understand the true dynamics of what had been happening. I don't regret helping my family when they needed it, but I also don't regret setting boundaries when that help was no longer appreciated or sustainable. Family relationships should be based on mutual respect and consideration, not financial dependence and emotional manipulation. The Easter dinner that changed everything turned out to be exactly what we all needed, even though it was painful at the time. Sometimes you have to lose something to understand its value, and sometimes you have to stand up for yourself to earn the respect you deserve.